Hyvää päivää, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of History with the Drywaller. One quick note before we begin in earnest today. I have a cold, unfortunately, so I apologize for any dips in sound quality or in residual congestion noises. I'm going to do my best to edit all that out, any sniffling or coughing or anything like that. But if anything gets through my editing process, I apologize in advance. Now that I've finished whining about my health, let's begin. When we left off in episode 1, we had just brought Finland to the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the Finnish Republic. So, unfortunately, because of the nature of Europe, many anthropologists actually incidentally call Europe the violent continent, and we're about to get to see why. These years from 1918 to 1930 or 1939 or 1940 or 1935, depending on who you ask, those are known as the interwar years. It's when everyone just sort of took a breath and then immediately started rearming to fight war again. Now, for Finland, this time was fairly eventful, this time being the later teens and into the 1920s. Just about immediately after the Republic was declared, in 1917 to 1920, the Finns and the Russians would engage in basically small-scale paramilitary raids. To my knowledge, I don't think either the Finns or the Russian government sanctioned these attacks, but paramilitary groups of Finns and paramilitary groups of Russians would do sort of a tit-for-tat raids and attacks on each other during this time. This time being the first half of the Russian Civil War, which lasted from 1917 to 1923. These specific clashes, these tit-for-tat paramilitary attacks, ended in 1920 with what's called the Treaty of Tartu, in which the Russians gave Finland the northern peninsula of Petsamo, because being in the middle of the Russian Civil War, the Russians had other things to worry about. Now, the Finns actually had other things to worry about at this time too, because in 1919, thanks in part to the influence of the Laestadians, the progenitors of the Old Apostolics, who we talked about last episode, Finland enacted the total prohibition of alcohol. Again, in 1919. Prohibition, was a complete disaster. Very similar to the experience that the Americans would have just a year or two later. Finland experienced enormous growth in crime and violence, and incarceration rate skyrocketed. It was a disaster. And this disaster luckily ended in 1932. But in Finland, in the 20s, much as in a lot of the rest of the Western world, the 1920s would be defined by badly enforced government-sponsored prohibition. But the 1920s in Finland was also defined by a very successful land reform program in which the Finnish government parsed out these old, sprawling, noble estates and auctioned them off to peasants. And that long tradition that we talked about last time of small-scale individual farming continued to strengthen and grow in Finland, even all this way into the 1920s. Unfortunately, more problems were to be found in the heady days of the 1920s. There were growing nationalist and fascist sentiments among a lot of the fighters who had been the whites in the Civil War. If you recall, they had been the people fighting against the Reds or the communists. So these whites were nationalists, fascists, protectionists, really not very pleasant people. And specifically, in this time of the Finnish Republic, they called themselves the Lapua movement, founded in and named after the town of Lapua. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And this group, this Lapua movement, would escalate into what's called the Mäntsälä Rebellion, which was essentially a coup by the Lapua movement against the rightfully elected government of Finland. This Mansala rebellion kicked off almost by accident on the 27th of February in 1932, in which 400 armed fascist militiamen, and again, these are the whites from the Civil War, they attacked a meeting of Social Democrats in Mansala. Thus, the Mansala Rebellion. Luckily, no one was hurt, not any of the fascists or the Social Democrats. Everyone got away okay, but after this initial attack, leading members of the whole Lapua movement would join the initial 400 fighters in Mansala and demand the sitting cabinet resign. The cabinet, down in Helsinki, refused and ordered the leaders of the Lapua movement arrested. Along with this order, they left a order that promised that basically the everymen, the rank and file members of the Lapua movement, would not be charged with any crimes if they laid down their weapons and went home. And as of now, there were about 6,000 to 8,000 far-right fascist militiamen gathered at Matsala, and almost all of them did. They put down their weapons, they went home, and the Finnish army would arrest 52 leaders of the Lapua movement. And that was the end of the Mansala Rebellion. The Lapua movement was made illegal and dissolved, with, 52 of its most illustrious members sitting in prison. And this entire episode, this entire Mansala Rebellion, this entire coup would lead to 0 casualties. Except one. There's a person, presumably a man, because, he's a fascist leader, they're usually men. He killed himself rather than go to prison. But I can't, for the life of me, find his name or anything about him. It's just the statistic that you see when you read about the Mansala Rebellion that, one of their guys killed himself. I don't know how he killed himself. I don't know why. But yeah, there you go. So there's one guy out there who killed himself when the rebellion failed, and history has apparently forgotten him. So there you go. Now, that's on the far right of Finnish politics. On the far left, during this time, Stalin was making a play at creating a new Soviet Socialist Republic in the new state of East Karelia, and which did not join Finland in their independence, by the way. Despite being relatively culturally Finnish, they're also very Eastern Orthodox, so they stuck with Russia. That's an oversimplification of that situation, by the way, but we're going to leave it at that. But this new state Stalin was trying to make requested that communist Finns from Finland go and join them to make the state, strong and proud, and to build socialist man and whatever it is that socialist states do when nobody's looking. And I can't find an exact figure, but around 10 to 20,000 radical communist Finns would emigrate to the Soviet Union to take up Stalin on his offer and become part of this new Karelian state. Now, these men really aren't much part of our story anymore, but just for the sake of closure, almost all of these people would end up being killed in Stalin's purges, because Stalin did not trust foreigners. And even though these men had, and women I'd imagine, had taken him up on this offer to become Karelians, he didn't trust him, and almost all of them would be killed. This Karelian state that had been the source of all this hubbub would end up being way cut back in size and eventually reabsorbed into the greater Russian state in the 50s. So I think it's fair to say that the moral of the story of this whole sorry episode is don't trust Joseph Stalin. But that just about covers us for the 20s and much of the 30s, and that means we have arrived at the Second World War. Now, as you're probably aware, the Second World War is a pretty big deal. And unfortunately, it's in large part outside of our scope for this episode. But Finland was active, as you can imagine, being stuck between the Nazis and the Soviets for a huge portion of the war. Finland would end up deeply, deeply tied to not only the twists and turns of battle, but really deeply invested in who was going to win. So I guess the place to start with Finland in the Second World War is with the Baltic states. Now, Stalin insisted that the Baltic states, which is Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, were a security threat to the Soviet Union, given that they were so close. Stalin thought that if someone wanted to attack the Soviet Union, that someone could then land in the Baltic states and just invade willy-nilly. Or at least that's what he said his concern was. What this basically meant for the Baltic states is Stalin said, hey, we would like to put troops in your countries, to which I believe all three of them said, okay. The troops went in, and then the troops stayed, and communists overthrew the governments of the three states, and they became part of the Soviet Union. So immediately after that, Stalin went to Finland and said, hey, we think your country is a security concern, and we would like to station troops in it. Now, as you can imagine, the Finns just outright refused to allow any Soviet troops in Finnish territory, probably suspecting quite rightly that the Soviets would then just take over their country. Stalin was not a fan of this, and he came up with a very typical Stalin plan to get Finland to agree. He shot artillery shells, or rather, he ordered artillery shells to be shot at a village on the Soviet side of the Finnish border. And then he claimed that the Finns had shot at the Russians. Russian people were killed in this attack. But to Stalin, this was, I guess, okay, because he got his excuse to attack Finland. It's not an excuse that anyone really believed, to my understanding, but it is the excuse that was given for a long time. Now, this brings me to a difficult decision to make, because in the mind of most modern Finns, the winter war between Russia, or rather the Soviet Union, and Finland is a defining moment not only of Finnish history, but of the Finnish national character, and, to put it more bluntly, one of the proudest moments of Finnish history. This is the Finnish equivalent of the Battle of Britain for the English. But because of that, there is a wealth of knowledge and literature around this that, quite frankly, has sort of already covered the topic ad nauseum. And because this episode is intended to be more of an overview of Finnish history, I'm just going to go over the Winter War in brief. Though at the end of my going over it in brief, I will link you to a lot of video and audio resources that you can then pursue if your interest is piqued by what I tell you today. So, Stalin staged his attack. He attacked and killed his own citizens just for a paper-thin excuse to invade Finland, and this invasion would go poorly. Now, as much as I'd like to tell you that the reason the invasion went poorly is because Finns are inherently tough and awesome, there's a lot more going on than that. And most of what causes the invasion to go so horribly wrong happens in the Soviet Union around Stalin himself. Now, at the time of the Soviet invasion of Finland, you have to remember that Germany has already invaded Poland and Czechoslovakia and is preparing to invade France and Belgium and all that. And these German invasions have been very impressive to international onlookers. This is where you get the advent of the famous Blitzkrieg, which it has to be said that the Germans themselves don't seem to have really used the term Blitzkrieg. To Germany, it was more often called things like Bewegungskrieg and Kesselschlacht, to my understanding, but that's neither here nor there. The upshot of all this for our purposes is that Stalin felt a little insecure. There's no other way to put it. He felt a little threatened by the Germans and by Adolf Hitler. And so part of the planning of the war against Finland was meant to demonstrate how advanced and strategically brilliant the Soviet military was. And so they made some interesting tactical and strategic decisions in order to show how advanced they were, while sort of hindering their actual combat abilities. For example, the initial plan that had been dreamed up by the Soviet General Staff for the invasion of Finland was basically just an armored spearhead that would go straight up the Karelian Isthmus and take Helsinki. It was just going to be what would later be called the Soviet Deep Strike. It was just going to be an armored spearhead that would be followed by waves and waves and waves of attacks. And this tactic would have likely worked, and it would have likely been very effective, but to Stalin, it looked sort of bland, as Dr. John Suprin says, it would have made him look like he wasn't hip, like he wasn't with it. So Stalin said, make another plan that's more grand. And so they did. Instead of attacking in one armored spearhead straight up the Karelian Isthmus, they basically made plans to have multiple armored spearheads attack along the entire border between the Soviet Union and Finland, which means that most of those armored columns were just going to charge straight into the barely mapped road systems in the Finnish forests. As you can imagine, this was not going to go great. But even beyond that, the initial plans to supply this attack were shuttered because Stalin decided that this entire operation was just going to take 12 days. So he demanded and ordered his officers to only supply the men for 12 days. Now, as you might know, this war took 3.5 months. So as you can imagine, after those initial 12 days are up, there's sort of a problem with the Soviet supply system. Okay, so that is essentially the problem. Now, in November 1939, the Soviets attack all over Finland, just as they were planning. And it went really bad. The attack up the Karelian Isthmus did not have the amount of support that it needed, and it stalled up against the Finnish defense line. The series of attacks all through the northern forests did great. They charged right into Finland and then discovered that there wasn't really anywhere to go. There were no major cities, there were no major supply depots, and they were getting constantly sniped, harassed, bombed, and picked off by Finnish troops, often quite literally on skis with submachine guns, which sounds absurd, except when you're trudging through the hills and the snow in northern Finland, being on skis is almost like being a superhero. And so the losses among these men in the north were breathtakingly high. Whole groups of soldiers would just disappear into the night. The Finns determined that, especially at nighttime, they could goad the Russians into firing on each other in the confusion. And so little groups of sometimes just a couple dozen Finns would slip in between large groups of Russians and antagonize both groups and then cause the Russians to go nuts, bombing and machine gunning each other. So while on paper, if you look at maps of the Winter War, the northern expeditions look like they're doing great because they just charge right across Finland. The casualties and the losses of those expeditions are staggering for the Soviets. And even military successes by the Soviets would soon turn out to be kind of meaningless in this new environment. Like, for example, the Soviets almost immediately established total air superiority in northern Finland, which seems great, except that this is northern Finland in the winter. And as we mentioned last episode with what's called the midnight sun, where during the summer the sun is out seemingly all the time, the opposite is true in the winter, where you can have daylight for only like 3 hours before the 21-hour night sets in. So, yippee skippy, you have air superiority, but it's just a frozen forest that's almost constantly at night. So there's nothing to see, there's nothing to hit. As often as not, the Soviet Air Force would be reduced to just dropping supplies, which were, as often as not, intercepted by the Finnish soldiers, who, again, being on skis, were way more mobile. They would go and they would intercept these supplies and then set an ambush for the poor Russians who are slogging through the freezing cold, pitch black forest trying to get to their food. And again, as we mentioned previously, they only have food and gas and shells for 12 days. So after the first 12 days come and go, the situation of these poor guys up in the frozen forest becomes real lousy real quick. And the main thrust at Karelia, up the Karelian Isthmus, scarcely did any better. They were able to engage the Finns, but because of a lack of good leadership and a lack of appropriate snow camouflage, what this attack would end up turning into is just waves and waves and waves of Soviet soldiers just being mowed down by Finnish machine guns and mortars and light artillery pieces. Also, as a brief aside, this war is when the famous Molotov cocktail is invented, because the Finns didn't have an effective anti-tank system, so they would fill bottles with gasoline with a lit rag and throw it into what is essentially the air intake of a tank, basically turning the inside of a tank into a flaming oven. And as for the name Molotov cocktail, it comes from my understanding, a story in which the Soviets bombed Finnish cities with their aforementioned air superiority, and then claimed to the international press that they weren't bombing these cities, they were dropping food, which of course was never true. But the Finns picked up on this, and finding some humor in it, they called these flaming bottles of gasoline Molotov cocktails, naming them after the Soviet foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov, saying that they were drinks to go with the food. But after 3.5 months of mowing down waves of Russians, international aid to Finland, though promised, never showed up. The Finns did all of this almost entirely alone. And so the leader of the Finnish military, a man by the name of Gustav Mannerheim, finally decided that it was time to make a deal with the Soviets, because at the end of the day, their army, while winning, was never going to be able to last against the Soviets. They just did not have the men or the bullets. And unfortunately, the Russian strategy at this time was almost literally to keep rushing forward until the Finns ran out of bullets. And that was actually looking like it was going to work. So Mannerheim decided that it was time to pursue a deal with the Soviets rather than have the Soviets make the deal while they held the Finnish capital. So a deal was made, and it was pretty nice for the Finns. The Soviets took some Finnish territory, but it was almost entirely just things that the Soviets had already captured in the rest of the war, and the Finns would retain independence, and no Soviet soldiers would sit on Finnish soil. Almost all Finnish civilians had been evacuated from the war zone, so no Finnish civilians were captured, not to my knowledge. And so even though it was technically a peace settlement, the consensus of the international community, both at the time and now, is that the Finns won the war. Now, I wish I could go into further detail on the Finnish Winter War. It is a fascinating topic, but I have a lot to cover and not a lot of time to cover it, so I will direct you towards a lecture. It's about an hour long by the Dole Institute of Politics on YouTube, in which Dr. John Suprin talks about the Soviet-Finnish Winter War. There's also a great book called A Frozen Hell by William R. Trotter, which is not only available in paperback, but is also available as an audiobook. And then there is a documentary also on YouTube by the channel Kings and Generals called The Winter War. And it's about an hour and I think 40 some minutes long. So if this topic has intrigued you, I would strongly urge you to go pursue these sources. They are all going to do a much more detailed job than I was able to do here. But getting back to the Finns, after they concluded the Winter War, Hitler would invade France, of course, and then try to attack Britain, and then turn around and invade the Soviet Union. And at this time, the Finns decided that it was time for some vengeance, and they attacked the Soviet Union at the same time as the Germans, though, to my understanding, not cooperating much militarily with the Germans. And this is called in Finland the Continuation War, because in their mind it was a continuation of the initial Winter War. Now, after the Germans were crushed at Stalingrad and began to fall back from the Soviet Union, Finland would sign an armistice with the Soviet Union. As you can imagine, the Soviets were not very interested in trying to invade Finland again. At this point, the Finns would turn on the Nazis, who during the Continuation War had started deploying troops throughout northern Finland, and they would launch what's called the Lapland War against the Germans and successfully drive them out of Finland and Sweden and back into Norway. Now, a quick note about the Finns and the Germans. The Finns were technically allied with the Germans through most of the war, and in fact, the British declared war on the Finns after or potentially during the Battle of Britain. But the Finns never meaningfully cooperated with the Germans. And in fact, Finland became one of the last safe havens for German Jews during the Second World War. The Finns never, to my understanding, released any Jews to Germany. So I think the position of Finland of sort of being allied with and fighting both sides in the war, I think, is more derived from their unfortunate position being stuck between the Nazis and the Soviets. Now, after the Second World War, you of course have the Cold War. And during the Cold War, Finland would be neutral. Finland would not be part of NATO, but it would also not be part of the Warsaw Pact. And as a neutral country, they would be a force for peace. They would often host summits in their capital city of Helsinki, looking for denuclearization or the easing of tensions between the Eastern and Western Bloc. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Finland would move out of their Cold War neutrality and into the orbit of Western Europe. Finland is now a member of the European Union, and although not technically a member of NATO, they are fully compliant politically and militarily with all NATO jurisdictions. Now, on the social and economic front, Finland is now a classic welfare state in line with the Nordic model of socioeconomics. Finland has one of the longest lived populations and one of the highest per capita incomes in the world. It is also recently ranked first in not only the Human World Capital Index, but also the Press Freedom Index, a fragile states index that measures how stable a country is, in which Finland ranked first recently. And it was second in the Global Gender Gap Report. It has also, quite famously, ranked first on the World Happiness Report for the years 2018, 2019, 2020, and 2021. So I think it's safe to say that the Finnish story has been one of struggle and grit and determination, but also reward and success. I think the Finnish story and the story of the Finnish people is one of success and victory against the odds and for the greater good. So with that being said, I am going to close out this episode 2 of History with a Drywaller. And on our next episode, episode 3, I hope to begin my exploration of the history of the Soviet Union. So I'll see you there.